Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about a scientific topic but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. And most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you listen to modern sermons or read popular books on spirituality, or really just absorb Western culture, the core message of Christianity often gets boiled down to one, let's be honest, highly successful slogan.
The God of love.
Exactly, the idea of a God of love.
It's the brand. It's the elevator pitch.
Yeah.
You know, we're told constantly that Jesus' central revolutionary innovation was introducing this radically new, gentle, compassionate concept of the divine.
A complete departure from the supposedly harsh, punitive God of the Old Testament.
That's the narrative.
And it is a powerful idea. I mean, it resonates really deeply with our modern moral sensibilities. But what happens when we set aside that devotional reading, step away from the cultural slogans and actually analyze the original source text, the Gospels, historically? Critically.
Well, this is what this whole deep dive is about. It's based on a textual critique that suggests that claim.
Yeah.
It largely collapses.
Collapses how?
The argument is, if you read the recorded words of Jesus without presupposing that loving outcome, without reading the ending back into the beginning, you find a figure whose message is centered not on metaphysical love, but on an imminent, terrifying judgment.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're going to analyze the evidence point by point and argue that the God of love is actually a later theological construction. It's something that was selectively projected backward by a tradition that was, frankly, trying to survive some pretty major intellectual and historical crises.
That is precisely our mission today. We're going to follow the source material ruthlessly. We want to determine what Jesus' recorded words actually suggest about the nature of God, about the fate of humanity. We want to see if the texts support that image of the gentle moral teacher, or if they point towards something far more challenging, something rooted in a really demanding apocalyptic core.
So prepare for some genuinely surprising facts. Things that directly challenge decades, if not centuries, of commonly held beliefs about the central message of Christianity.
All right, let's get into it. Where do we even begin with a claim this big?
We have to start with the foundation, with the most inconvenient textual fact that often gets minimized or, ignored or just spiritualized away by modern liberal theology.
Okay.
Jesus explicitly, and I mean explicitly, affirms the Hebrew Bible and the God of the Old Testament Yahweh. He doesn't offer a gentle amendment to the divine identity. He confirms it.
This is the foundation, isn't it? Because if Jesus were truly introducing a fundamentally different God, a God of pure, universal love that just superseded everything that came before.
You'd expect him to say so.
Yeah, you'd expect him to clearly distance himself from the Old Testament law, the Torah, and the prophets. He'd have to draw a line in the sand.
You absolutely would. But when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 17, he gives a direct, unambiguous statement about his position. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them."
And this is the hinge point. It all comes down to how we interpret that one really powerful verb, fulfill. Because most modern listeners, I think, we hear fulfill and we think to complete and therefore conclude. Like you fulfill a contract and then the contract is over. The old terms are null and void.
That's a totally anachronistic reading, though, a modern reading. To understand what fulfill means here, you have to place it squarely in its historical context, which is Second Temple Judaism.
Okay, so what did it mean to that audience?
In that environment, fulfill, the Greek word is polero, it doesn't mean to neutralize or to spiritualize or to soften the law and make it obsolete. It means to bring it into its full, perfect force.
It's full force, so like to implement it completely.
Implementation and intensification, that's the key. He's not saying the old rules are gone, here's my gentle new philosophy. He is saying the rules are real, they are absolute, and I am here to make sure they are realized in their most demanding, complete form.
That changes everything. It's not a cancellation, it's an upgrade, a more intense version.
Exactly. Think about the context. There were all these contemporary Jewish legal debates going on. Rabbinic teachers at the time were constantly debating the nuances of the law, and their goal was almost always to strengthen and reinforce its application, not weaken it.
Right.
So when Jesus uses this language, he's positioning himself as the authoritative interpreter, the one who will uphold the law's divine authority and demand a standard of obedience even higher than what the scribes and Pharisees expected.
And he doesn't leave any room for doubt on this, does he? He immediately reinforces the point, almost as if he knows people are going to misinterpret him.
He does. He gives this absolute enduring mandate right after. He says, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law.
That is incredibly specific.
It's not a metaphor. He's talking about the yod, which is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, or the tiniest little serif, the stroke on the letters. It's the ultimate statement you can make about textual authority and immutability. He's saying not even the punctuation is up for debate.
Wow. That level of detail, the minutia of the text, it signals that the entire framework of the law and the prophets remains in place. That's the definitive, eternal measure of righteousness and judgment.
And this is where the modern discomfort comes in. Because if you, the listener, feel a deep moral or emotional discomfort toward the God of the Old Testament,
and many people do.
of course,
Yeah.
the God who orders war, the God who demands specific, often violent temporal punishments, the God associated with, exclusionary rituals and the defeat of other nations, Jesus does not offer you an escape from that.
He places himself squarely within that tradition. He's endorsing it.
He is. So the radical break that we're all taught about, this huge shift from the punishing judge to the universal lover, it just doesn't exist at this foundational level.
He endorses the judge.
He's saying, that guy, I'm with him. He is. If Yahweh is consistently portrayed in the Hebrew Bible as a judge who executes righteous, temporal punishment on people through war, famine, plague, then Jesus, by upholding the authority of Yahweh, is upholding the authority of that judge. The whole God of love thesis requires you to functionally ignore what Jesus himself said his mission was.
And we have to remember the context of that mission. He wasn't trying to found a worldwide 2,000-year-long church.
No, not at all. That was never the plan.
He was preparing people for the imminent and forceful arrival of Yahweh's kingdom on earth. This was an apocalyptic movement.
Precisely. His entire ministry was framed by this conviction that the present evil age was ending, and ending very, very soon. The God he was preaching wasn't some abstract metaphysical concept of goodness.
Yeah.
It was the specific, powerful, covenantal judge of Israel who was about to descend and forcefully implement his kingdom, based on the fulfillment of those very laws he just said he was here to complete. This foundational endorsement of the judge is the necessary and often avoided starting point for any critical reading of the Gospels.
Okay, so that's the doctrinal foundation. Let's move on from that and look at the recorded actions and his rhetoric. Because the modern image is, the gentle shepherd, the quiet moral philosopher.
Sunday school Jesus.
Yeah, Sunday school Jesus. But the sources suggest that image only really survives through some pretty selective cherry picking.
Absolutely. The perception of unique gentleness just dissolves the moment you start looking at the incidents the sources describe that require massive power, aggression, and swift judgment.
Yeah.
They are frequently glossed over precisely because they challenge that easy narrative.
So what are the main examples the source uses to disrupt this narrative of passivity? The fig tree incident is always a fascinating one. It seems so strange.
The fig tree incident, which is in both Mark and Matthew, is deeply disruptive to the gentle narrative. It's bizarre on the surface.
Yeah.
Jesus walks up to a fig tree, finds it has no fruit.
And the text even notes it wasn't the season for figs.
Right, which makes his reaction even more startling. He curses it. He literally curses the tree, and it withers and dies almost instantly.
If you read that literally, it just sounds like a bizarre, extreme overreaction to a minor botanical disappointment. Like he was having a really bad, hungry day.
But historically, this is understood as something far more profound. It is pure prophetic symbolism, but the form it takes is punitive.
What's the symbolism?
The fig tree was a common symbol for Israel, or more specifically, the temple establishment in Jerusalem. So, by failing to bear fruit, the fruit of righteousness, the spiritual fruit God expects, It represents an act of disobedience in anticipation of the impending divine kingdom.
So the tree is a stand-in for the nation.
It is. And the act of cursing it to death is a demonstration of punitive divine force applied in miniature. It's a prophetic warning shot, signaling the destructive judgment that is awaiting the larger non-compliant nation. It's a physical enactment of his coming judgment.
So it's the authority of the judge applied physically to a living thing.
It is a clear act of non-gentle enforcement. It demonstrates that Jesus possesses and is more than willing to exercise destructive power to punish symbolic failure. It fundamentally refutes the idea of a purely passive, hands-off moralist who just, offers suggestions for improvement.
Okay, and then you have the temple disruption. This is probably the most famous moment, where he overturns the tables of the money changers. This is one of the most physically aggressive acts recorded in his entire ministry.
It's a literal riot, and Jesus instigated it. The texts say he throws people out, he overturns the tables of commerce, completely interrupting the socioeconomic engine of the temple. And in John's gospel, he even uses a whip of cords.
A whip. We tend to forget that part.
People always forget the whip. This is not meek protest. It is a prophetic, violent cleansing. It's a powerful demonstration of his authority to judge and punish corruption and economic injustice within that sacred space.
When we only focus on the ethical sermons like the Sermon on the Mount, we miss that the temple incident is fundamentally a political and prophetic act. It's him establishing his claim to messianic authority.
And that authority includes the right to use physical force to purge what he deemed corrupt. Absolutely. The gentle shepherd does not fashion a weapon and commit property damage and physical expulsion. This act, just like the cursing of the fig tree, is fully consistent with the role of an apocalyptic herald.
A herald who is preparing for the imminent, forceful establishment of God's perfect kingdom.
Which necessarily involves the violent removal of the unworthy.
And it's not just his actions, we have his rhetoric too. We tend to sanitize the language Jesus uses toward his opponents, but it was harsh.
The sources show he was relentless and brutal in his condemnation. He used what we would today call highly exclusionary, fiery, and deeply insulting language. He calls the religious leaders hypocrites, snakes, and the phrase that should really stand out is children of hell.
He calls them children of Gehenna specifically.
Yes, children of Gehenna. And that's not just a disagreement. That's him pronouncing spiritual condemnation and damnation upon them.
It is. It's an announcement of their moral fate. He's separating his followers, the righteous remnant, from the doomed religious establishment. This rhetoric is entirely consistent with a figure announcing imminent catastrophic judgment. It places him directly in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets who delivered these warnings of doom.
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon Hopefully, in the future, I'm going to write also about religion, atheism, and science. But I do have a podcast. I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion. The same name of the podcast. And you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion, and atheism. So, hope you enjoyed the show. So, let's come back to the show.
And finally, he takes this judgment to a mass scale with his threats against entire cities. This shows that the potential for judgment goes far beyond just individual failure.
Right, this isn't just about a few corrupt leaders.
Not at all. He directs his wrath at places that failed to respond to his ministry, specifically the cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida. He explicitly states that on the day of judgment, their destruction would be worse than that of Sodom.
Now, for the listener, Sodom is the Old Testament's quintessential example of complete, overwhelming, annihilating divine wrath. It was the benchmark for total devastation.
It was the worst-case scenario. So by threatening a worse fate, Jesus is explicitly elevating the scale and severity of temporal punishment for those who reject his message. He's the herald of ultimate divine judgment on a national scale.
He is positioning himself as the one whose message determines whether you face historical, annihilating destruction.
Exactly. The source suggests that the image of the gentle moralist requires us to minimize these powerful, aggressive, and punitive examples. They are not peripheral. They are central to the role of the apocalyptic judge.
This brings us to what is maybe the most challenging textual fact of all. The sources argue that Jesus discusses punishment more than anyone else in the New Testament. And in doing so, he represents a dramatic escalation of moral stakes, especially regarding the afterlife, not a softening.
This is so critical because if Jesus' central innovation was love, you'd expect him to, ameliorate the consequences of human failure, make things better. Instead, he made them absolute and eternal.
So to understand his innovation, we first need to establish the baseline he inherited from the Hebrew Bible. What was the common understanding of the afterlife then?
The baseline was Sheol.
Define Sheol for us in the context of the pre-Christian Jewish world.
Sheol was generally understood as this shadowy, subterranean realm of the dead. And crucially, it was vague, silent, dusty, and fundamentally morally neutral.
Morally neutral.
Yes. It was not a place of torment or reward. It was simply the universal resting place where all souls, the righteous and the wicked, went after death.
So if you were King David or a notorious criminal, you both ended up in Sheol. It was just the end, an equalization of fate.
Exactly. It lacked all the fiery, punitive, eternal characteristics that later Christian hell would adopt. Punishment under Yahweh was generally temporal. It happened in this life.
Like defeat in battle, exile, famine, physical illness.
Right, it happened in history. Once you died, you went to the silence of Sheol. The books were closed.
But Jesus changes that entire landscape, and this is where he introduces specific innovations that just ratchet up the severity of moral failure exponentially.
He introduces Gehenna,
which we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What is it exactly?
Yeah. Gehenna is the Greek rendering of the Hebrew Gehinnom, which means the Valley of Hinnom. It was a real physical valley just outside Jerusalem. And historically, it had a very dark past for Israel. It was associated with child sacrifices to the god Molech.
A truly cursed place, then.
A cursed place. And later, during Jesus' time, it was often used as the city's garbage dump, a place where refuse, animal carcasses, even the bodies of executed criminals were thrown and burned. So it was a site of continuous fire, refuse, smoke, and decay.
So Jesus takes this physical, temporal location, a place of literal filth, fire, and destruction, and he transforms it into the primary symbol for eternal, conscious, divine punishment.
He weaponizes its symbolism, the eternal fire, the worm that does not die. These are images drawn from the literal refuse and decay of that valley, but now they're projected onto an unending metaphysical fate.
And along with that comes the terrifying, vivid imagery that has defined popular concepts of hell for 2 millennia.
Eternal fire. And the gruesome image of weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Those are highly visceral, terrifying descriptions. They convey conscious, unending suffering. This is the radical break, isn't it? He's the one who explicitly contrasts everlasting punishment with everlasting life.
That distinction makes the stakes binary and absolute. It's one or the other. We are no longer talking about temporal punishment in history or a shadowy rest in Sheol. We are talking about eternal reward, or eternal conscious suffering. The entire framework shifts from a vague, morally neutral afterlife to a fiery, punitive, eternal one.
Let's focus on the implications of that moral escalation for a second. If the idea of eternal punishment, the whole theological problem of the damned, is morally troubling to people today,
Which it is.
the source analysis suggests that this problem does not originate centuries later with theologians like Augustine or, in Dante's Inferno.
It starts directly with Jesus himself. He is the one who codified and popularized the language and imagery of eternal torment in the New Testament tradition. He dramatically raised the stakes of what it means to be human and to fail.
So the claim that he introduced a God of love becomes textually unstable.
Extremely. If the whole purpose was to introduce unconditional love and forgiveness, why would the founder spend so much time describing a punishment system that is far more terrifying and absolute than anything that came before it in his own tradition? It seems fundamentally at odds.
It points back to his primary function being that of an apocalyptic judge, warning humanity about the severity of the imminent cosmic audit.
Exactly. His warnings were designed to instill immediate, overwhelming urgency. The stakes were no longer just your temporal life or death, they were your life or death for eternity. This rhetorical strategy is entirely consistent with an apocalyptic prophet. The judge has to be perceived as terrifying to enforce the necessary narrow obedience required to survive what's coming.
Of course, the moment we raise these points, the listener is rightly thinking of the counter-evidence. The primary retort to this judge thesis is always going to be the famous command to love your enemies.
It's the go-to passage.
It's universally cited as the unique moral breakthrough of Jesus. But the source argues that even this beloved ethic has to be read within its specific, limited, and imminent context. It's not a declaration of universal humanism.
This contextualization is so crucial. When you read the texts critically, you see that the ethic of loving your enemies, and the Sermon on the Mount ethics in general, was addressed specifically to an in-group.
His immediate followers.
His immediate followers, the disciples, and those gathered around them. The people who were preparing for the final violent arrival of God's kingdom. It was a rigorous rule for internal conduct within a highly disciplined sectarian community. An instruction for the few who were deemed worthy.
So this wasn't a piece of advice for the Roman Empire or for humanity at large?
No. This practice of radical non-retaliation and high ethical purity was undertaken specifically in anticipation of imminent divine judgment. The instruction to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect, was a demanding spiritual discipline. Why? To make this small group worthy of entering the soon-to-arrive kingdom of God. It was a strategy for internal holiness in the face of external, catastrophic cosmic change.
And here is the crucial conceptual point, the one that I think a lot of people miss. The ethic of loving your personal enemies is entirely compatible with the belief that God will soon destroy most of humanity.
This is the element that undermines the universal humanism claim entirely. It's the difference between human action and divine action.
Explain that.
The followers are commanded to practice non-retaliation and forgiveness toward their personal enemies, whether that's someone in their village who persecutes them or the Roman authorities. But this individual practice does not alter the apocalyptic reality that God himself is about to descend and violently, decisively destroy everyone who has not followed this narrow path.
Yeah. So the command is not a statement about the universal value of all human life in the eyes of God. It's a command to demonstrate superior righteousness so that you may be saved when God executes judgment.
It's a mechanism for achieving purity under pressure. It's a highly exclusive, selective practice. And Jesus reinforces this exclusivity over and over again with his insistence that most people are going to fail to meet this standard.
This is where you have to bring in the famous quote on selectivity, because it directly contradicts the idea of a gentle God who's intent on saving everyone.
Jesus' own words are stark. The gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it.
Few who find it.
Few. You cannot reconcile that statement with universal unconditional love. If the God Jesus preached was defined by unconditional love, the gate would be wide, the way would be easy, and the conclusion would be, all find it, or at least most find it. The text explicitly states few.
This language, the narrow gate, the arduous path, it defines the movement not as a philosophical or moral abstraction for all of humanity, but as what the source terms sectarian apocalypticism.
Yes. It's an intense, demanding, and exclusive ethical mandate. It's designed for a small, self-selecting group preparing for the literal, violent establishment of God's perfect earthly kingdom. It requires an obedience that is just impossible for the masses.
And that is far removed from Enlightenment ethics of universal human dignity or the later Christian concept of God as metaphysical love.
Completely. The command to love was a functional requirement for achieving the high ethical standard needed to survive the imminent judgment. It wasn't an end in itself, applied universally to all people for all time.
It fundamentally changes the emotional weight of the instruction, doesn't it? It's not be nice because everyone is valued. It's achieve perfect righteousness because the fire is coming, and only those who achieve this difficult perfection will survive.
And this framework, the imminence of judgment, the narrowness of the path, the eternal stakes, it just brings us back repeatedly to the central textual reality. Jesus' God is fundamentally a judge who is about to make a definitive, exclusive, and eternal ruling.
Okay, so if the textual Jesus is defined by apocalyptic judgment and intensifying the law, where did the highly successful, globally dominant slogan, God is love, even come from? This seems to be the point where the historical circumstances of the early church force a theological pivot.
This is the most crucial historical context of our entire deep dive. The explicit phrase, God is love, is a late theological construction. It appears nowhere in the sayings of Jesus recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It comes from the text from John.
And how late are we talking here?
We're talking decades after Jesus' death, well into the post-apostolic era, possibly 70 to 100 years after his ministry. By this point, the initial expectation of immediate catastrophe had faded. It didn't happen. And the tradition was facing some severe contextual realities that necessitated a profound theological shift just to maintain viability.
So what were those specific contextual drivers? What forced the Christian tradition to pivot away from Jesus, the apocalyptic judge, and toward this concept of abstract metaphysical love?
The source identifies three key related drivers. The first, and the most existential one, was the failure of the apocalypse Jesus predicted.
The end of the world didn't come.
It didn't happen. Jesus promised, in no uncertain terms, that the kingdom of God would arrive with great force and judgment within the lifetime of his immediate audience. When that generation passed, and then a second generation passed, and the world just continued on as normal, that created an existential crisis for the surviving community.
The core theological timeline, the foundation of the original message, was wrong. So how do you maintain belief when your central prophecy fails?
You have to reinterpret. You have to demote the temporal urgency and internalize the message. The community had to ask, was the coming purely spiritual? Was it postponed indefinitely? Or, and this is the crucial move, did they need to redefine the very nature of the God who was supposed to execute the judgment in the first place?
That leads directly to the second driver you mentioned. Christianity spread into the Greco-Roman world.
Exactly. It moved out of its narrow, localized Jewish context, and it collided with the wide intellectual currents of Hellenistic or Greek philosophy.
Which was a totally different ballgame.
A different universe. The educated intellectual elites of the Roman Empire in places like Alexandria, Athens, and Rome, they were intensely interested in metaphysical abstraction. They wanted to discuss the logos, the ultimate good, Platonic ideals, universal moral philosophy. They were concerned with the immutable essence of the cosmos.
And Jewish apocalypticism, with its fiery prophecy about the end of the world in Jerusalem, adherence to minor laws, and a judging God who violently destroys nations, that would have been a tough sell.
It was difficult, if not impossible, to translate credibly into that sophisticated intellectual framework. It was a serious handicap. To gain intellectual respectability in the Hellenistic world, Christianity had to shed its intensely parochial temporal focus. You can't sell a philosophical system based on a failed doomsday clock. You need enduring universal principles.
And this brings us to the third driver. The need to reinterpret its founder to remain psychologically and socially viable as an enduring proselytizing institution.
An enduring global institution cannot be founded solely on the constant immediate threat of total sectarian destruction. That message only works for an apocalyptic cult that's expecting to disband next Tuesday. For long-term survival, for growth, for missionary outreach across diverse, geographically distant cultures, the faith needed permanence, organizational structure, and a message that transcended local conflict and a failed timeline.
And this necessity demanded a radical theological evolution. The source maps this out in three distinct shifts that completely transformed the faith.
The first shift was from imminent judgment to an enduring institution. The focus shifted from the external, catastrophic end of the world to the inter-reality of the church. The mission became defining theology, establishing hierarchy, developing rituals, and organizing a bureaucracy that was capable of outlasting centuries rather than just preparing for the immediate violent end of history.
So the energy went from looking up at the sky for the judge to looking around at the community for the structure.
Perfectly put. And the second shift, moving from Jewish apocalypticism to Hellenistic moral abstraction. Instead of worrying about following the minutiae of the law, the strokes of the letters Jesus affirmed, the focus shifted to broad, abstract concepts like universal virtue, Platonic metaphysics, and the ultimate logos, the word or reason.
That makes the faith intellectually competitive. The Greek-speaking, educated listener could engage with Christianity as a philosophy, not just as a peculiar Jewish sect with a failed prophet.
And this facilitates the final, most defining shift, moving from Yahweh's kingdom, a temporal, political, geographic reality of decisive judgment, to metaphysical love.
Ah, there it is.
Love became not just one ethical command for a small in-group, but the ultimate defining essence of God itself. God is not just loving. God is love. This shift allows for the universalization of the faith, because love is an abstraction that's applicable anywhere, anytime.
So what we're really observing is a necessary process of theological evolution. The God of Love slogan became so profoundly successful precisely because it allowed Christianity to survive the failure of its initial prophecy and become intellectually justifiable in the sophisticated Hellenistic world.
It compensated for the temporal failure by focusing on the eternal nature of God's essence. It was brilliant institutional adaptation. The local, judging, angry God of the imminent end was transformed into the universal, enduring, abstract source of metaphysical goodness. The slogan made Christianity palatable, justifiable, and marketable to the entire world.
Okay, so let's synthesize the actual textual development that Jesus represents within his own tradition. The source acknowledges that Jesus is a profound development within Judaism. It's not saying nothing changed.
Oh, absolutely not.
But it was primarily a development that dramatically raised the stakes of moral failure rather than softening the moral requirements.
Yes. If we accept the textual evidence, we have to conclude that Jesus intensified the requirements of the law and multiplied the penalties for failure. To illustrate this, let's compare the two judges, Yahweh, the Hebrew Bible judge, and Jesus' judge.
Okay, start with the consequences under the traditional Yahweh.
Under Yahweh, as we said, moral consequences are temporal. They happen in this life. He targets nations, Israel, Egypt, Babylon, and individuals collectively. His punishments manifest through historical events: war, famine, plague, exile. Moral failure risked being historically defeated or removed from the promised land.
And crucially, the system punished actions. You murdered, you stole, you committed adultery, observable behaviors.
Exactly. The consequences were severe, but the outcome was always historical and temporal. If you sinned, you or your people suffered in time.
So that's the old system. Now, let's look at Jesus' system, what the source calls the ultimate systems upgrade. Jesus radically changes the scope of sin in two massive ways.
The first change is that he internalizes the law, which has the effect of universalizing guilt.
This is a critical move.
It is. Jesus shifts the focus from external, observable obedience, did you keep the Sabbath? Did you commit murder? To the innermost intentions of the heart. The famous examples from the Sermon on the Mount are staggering. Under the old law, murder was the crime. Under Jesus, just being angry is the crime, making you liable to the fire of hell.
And adultery.
Under the old law, adultery was the crime. Under Jesus, if you look with lust, you have already committed adultery in your heart.
That means the moral baseline is now completely unattainable by human effort. If sin is a matter of thought, then virtually everyone is constantly guilty of breaking the law. The standard is elevated to an impossible perfection.
It creates universalized guilt. By making the standard internal and mental, he ensured that everyone, from the most outwardly pious religious leader to the common peasant, fails. Everyone falls under the shadow of the coming judgment.
And the second shift, which pairs perfectly with this universalized guilt, is that he eternalizes the punishment.
This is the penalty multiplier. Moral failure no longer risks exile or death or historical misfortune. It risks eternity in Gehenna. Conscious, unending suffering. The universalized guilt meets the eternalized consequence. It's a perfect trap.
That's a powerful distinction. The source's systems perspective highlights that the penalty for moral default is multiplied exponentially. The original system punished errors in this life. The upgraded system punishes errors for all time.
To then look at this dramatic raising of the stakes, this shift from historical judgment to universal, internal, and eternal condemnation, and call it a God of love, well, it requires extraordinary interpretive gymnastics. You have to ignore the fundamental textual mechanism of his teaching.
So Jesus' innovation wasn't softening the divine standard.
It was making the standard impossible to meet and making the consequences for failing to meet it absolute and unending.
The Jesus we recognize from popular culture, then, the gentle, philosophical teacher who preaches unconditional love, is a theological figure born of institutional necessity decades after the fact.
That's the argument.
The Jesus we get when we read the texts critically, especially Matthew and the apocalyptic sections of the Gospels, is a figure demanding radical, unattainable obedience and warning of imminent, eternal, catastrophic destruction for the vast majority of humanity.
Central textual reality remains that Jesus' core message was apocalyptic judgment and the highly demanding requirements necessary to escape it.
So we've laid it all out. We've shown that the historical Jesus, based on his recorded words and actions, places himself as the heir to the punishing Yahweh, intensifies the law, and escalates the consequences of failure to an eternal dimension. So why? Why does the God of love narrative persist so successfully, even when it's challenged by the very source texts we've just reviewed?
Well, the source material offers three powerful and interdependent reasons for the narrative's persistence. First, and this is the big one, Christians and the general public rarely read the Gospels critically.
They read devotionally.
Exactly. When you approach a text devotionally, you're seeking comfort, inspiration, and affirmation of your existing beliefs. You're not conducting historical or textual analysis. You are seeking a personal relationship with the divine. The goal is spiritual uplift, which naturally favors the softer, more comforting passages.
Which leads directly into the second reason. Churches and religious institutions emphasize selected verses completely divorced from their full context.
Of course. The compassionate, mercy-focused parables are highlighted. They're the Sunday sermon material. Meanwhile, the harsh, exclusionary, or apocalyptic statements, the cursing of the fig tree, the threats against Chorazin, the vivid descriptions of Gehenna are routinely minimized.
Or spiritualized away as non-literal.
Right, or they're just simply ignored in favor of the more palatable material. The context of imminent judgment, which frames everything, is stripped away entirely.
And finally, there's the human tendency of retrofitting our modern moral intuitions onto these ancient texts.
We can't help it. We live in a post-Enlightenment world where concepts like universal human rights, nonviolence, and unconditional compassion are held as supreme moral goods. We want a God who reflects those values.
So I go looking for that God in the text.
We approach the ancient texts, determined to interpret them in a way that aligns with our current moral consensus. We ignore the historical and sectarian contexts that shaped the original message of exclusion and judgment because it makes us uncomfortable.
The intellectual consequence of this analysis, then, is that Jesus is not some harmless moral teacher who accidentally inspired a harsh apocalyptic religion 2,000 years later.
No, he is the source of that apocalyptic core. The God of love is a later Christian idea, a necessary, successful theological adaptation used to ensure institutional survival and global spread. But Jesus' God is fundamentally, textually, a judge.
It forces a kind of intellectual honesty, doesn't it?
It does. It compels you to acknowledge that the movement's most successful slogan is not rooted in the founder's immediate ministry, but actually in the need to adapt to the failure of that ministry's central prophecy.
So what stands out to you? After all this deep dive forces us to look beyond the catechism, beyond the comforting slogans, and just confront the original texts honestly, recognizing the historical and textual evidence as it stands, irrespective of what we might wish the faith had to say about the nature of God.
And understanding the evolution of these central concepts is so important. It's not an attack on faith, it's an intellectual exercise showing how a concept evolves over decades, driven by these profound contextual pressures, the failure of prophecy, the need for sophisticated intellectual justification in the Hellenistic world, and how that ultimately creates the very slogan that defined the faith today.
That is the essential takeaway. So here's a final thought to leave you with. If the concept of the God of love was a necessary adaptation for Christianity to survive its initial crisis and spread into the intellectual world of Greco-Roman philosophy, what modern slogans or accepted theological ideas, maybe within any contemporary belief system, might be similarly rooted not in original text or revelation, but in institutional necessity, cultural comfort, or the need to resolve internal doctrinal crises? That's something to mull over the next time you engage with the core claims of any powerful, enduring system of belief.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence. And also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium. And there are several blog posts there. And you can enjoy it, you can read it. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.